All right. Good evening and welcome to the Week 7 edition of the Football Diehards DFS show, taking you through the first Bimageddon of the year. Although that's not really a big thing for us in DFS, which is one of the beauties of the game. But I am your host, Jamie Calando at JAC3600, joined as always by the handsome and knowledgeable Eric Romoff at Fantasy Nav. Eric, we didn't get to do the show together last week. You manned the ship on your own, and we didn't get a chance to talk. But how was your week 6 in DFS?
Week 6 was a little hit or miss for me. I did okay in my cash coverage, so kind of mitigated my tournament play. But the tournament side was not my best week, honestly. There were a couple of spots that I was relatively highly invested in that just didn't pan out. So yeah, still chasing that big one from a few weeks ago, but fortunately, I think we've got a pretty interesting slate to attack this week.
We do, and there's some injury things that are going to take us pretty much right up till we'll probably be tinkering right up until Sunday at 12:59 with this thing, but. Hopefully we'll get some clarity over the next couple of days because the injury news definitely impacts the DFS slate as much as it does, all of us in our season long. I managed to salvage week 6. It was looking like I was just gonna bubble out, which is very frustrating. But Zach Ertz managed 2 catches on that final Arizona drive to just get me into most of the double ups and over the hump where I won 56% of the head to head. So not a big win, but profit is profit. So we'll escape with a win there.
Zach Ertz was those last couple catches were a game changer for me as well. He was just doing absolutely nothing up until that point. So nice to see him eke a little production over the line.
Yeah, and we'll get to him when we get to the tight end position too, because we did see. I've been kind of wondering as the season went along if it was going to ever be Trey McBride season. Ertz has been such a kind of safety blanket for Josh Dobbs, but now that they're losing it, like really losing, it looks like Trey McBride took over. He ran more routes and played more snaps than Ertz last week for the first time. So we'll see where you are on that one when we get to the tight end position. But a little bit of housekeeping, first of all, before we get into the slate. We're going to go position by position, kind of break down, the high, the middle, and the low for those of you that are new maybe to the show, and kind of see where they fit into the DFS slate, whether their money's worth it, whether they're a cash play, whether they're a GPP play. Eric and I are pretty good pairing here because I'm mainly a cash player and Eric dabbles a little more in the GPP. So we can hopefully give you 2 perspectives on the player. And as always, if you have questions, don't be afraid to put them in that chat right now, and we will get to your questions. They can be season long, they can be DFS. We're joined by the great Bob Harris already in chat, who says you're handsome and knowledgeable, which is a powerful combo there, Eric. But it is. There are so few of us, right? that it goes far. So thanks for joining, Bob, and tune in as always to Bob and Mike on the Football Diehards on the weekends. I'll be jumping on with them at 10:20 Eastern tomorrow night in my regular spot to talk DFS, which I think you also did last week, right? You were on there last week with them.
I did, yeah. I was making the full Jamie rounds. I got to be host on this show. Got to fill in on SXM. So fun weekend. Glad to have you back though. The hosting duties are a bear, and you handle them gracefully.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you, and I'm glad to be back. It was the pep band. Direct to the pep band at these football games gets tiring on these Friday nights, especially when I got to miss these shows with you guys. But I'm glad to be back. So let's get down to it. And again, get those questions going. We'll be more than happy to try and help you set your lineups. So we're going to start with the quarterback position. Quarterback's weird a bit this week. We've got, Well, I'll start, I guess, with the cash. Patrick Mahomes. Let's talk about him first and foremost because I mean, when we're looking at this slate kind of as a whole, you really should probably be gravitating to Mahomes with Jalen Hurts with that Miami Philadelphia game not on the main slate. Mahomes is 8,300 on DraftKings, which is expensive, especially on such a dynamic pricing site as DraftKings. But when you look back, what this Chargers team has given up to quarterbacks, I mean, they gave up 24.8 to Dak last week. They've given up 29.6 to Cousins. They've given up 32.1 to Tua, and even 21 points to Ryan Tannehill. And now we're talking about Patrick Mahomes, the most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. So it's hard for me to spend that much at quarterback in cash on DraftKings just because you need to really allocate those dollars, specifically across the positions. And I'm kind of into spending somewhat up on 3 running backs in cash this week. So it's kind of difficult for me, but I will say that it's more than worth it. I mean, if he's in your cash plans, you really can't go wrong if there's values that you like at other positions. Where are you on Mahomes? And if you're playing him in GPPs, how are you handling maybe stacking him? Because we know what a pain that KC receiver room can be, and they just traded back for Mecole Hardman, which muddies it even more. So how are you handling Mahomes on this slate?
Yeah, so I think Mahomes is definitely on the board, both for a cash play, just given how consistent he is. He's kind of having a down year by his standards, and I think he's still QB4 or QB5 on points per game. So the matchup is golden, but also the board is kind of ugly this week, right? You've got this Chargers Chiefs game that has a 48 total, and then everything else is like 45 and below, several games into the high 30s. So this is my way of saying that finding ways to get into this game is going to be a priority. And where we sit right now, I think thanks in large part to that lofty price tag, Patrick Mahomes is only around 5 or 6% rostered, right? So if this holds steady into tomorrow, into lineup lock, I will be much more interested in him. I think he's probably going to settle in around that 8 to 10% range, and at which point I'll be rotating him in within those stacks. And that game environment and the presumed gold rush of managers building around that game is really going to inform the approach that we take, right? It's kind of musical chairs in the receiving room. There's a couple of guys on the Chiefs side that are set to draw some pretty heavy rostership. So, working around those guys is going to be a priority. But I mean, look, there's one game that has this high of a total. So, Patrick Mahomes almost has to be on the board if you want to find a way to get into it.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. And I mean, I guess we can save it for the tight end talk again too. But are you at all concerned? It's Kelsey and it's the rest when we're talking about his stack partners here. But I mean, are you concerned at all with Derwin James as if he's able to handle Kelsey? Does that negatively affect Mahomes enough that you're not willing to go overweight on him, perhaps, or are you spicy enough that you can maybe even stack Mahomes without Kelsey and maybe hope the receivers hit?
Yeah, I think it's more so the latter, right? Travis Kelsey by most standards is actually, or I should say, Travis Kelsey by his standards is actually having a bit of a down year as well. By tight end standards, he's doing just fine for himself, right? So if it's going to be a down spot for him with that tough matchup against James, I don't mind kind of spinning the roulette wheel and trying to find ways around him. But secondarily, with Kelsey's price tag at 8K flat, with Mahomes at 8.3K, like I don't know if we're going to see a lot of people click the button on both. At least it's going to be hard to afford that, right? So, trying to find creative ways to validate and justify that expenditure is going to be one of the keys to the slate, I think.
Yeah, it's especially with the pricing too. You mentioned it's hard to afford that, especially if you want to full stack this game and you got to come back with Keenan Allen or Austin Eckler. It's even more difficult to fit that in and have a viable lineup across the rest of the board. We do have Josh Palmer at 4,800, which we'll get to later on, who is a nice little value to come back with him too. But he's
Yeah.
I don't know if he's who you're looking for as like the comeback thing in this Chiefs stack as well. So it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting. I think the best thing to do here is play around with some lineups, see what you like, see what you get as far as unique goes. We'll talk about other Chiefs with respect to this game at the other positions. I mean, we're going to hit every single one in this game. But as for me, as far as cash, if I'm paying up, it's Mahomes or it's nothing. I'm paying down. So I have almost no interest in the other high-end quarterbacks, but what is it that you're seeing as far as GPPs go with the Allens, the Herberts, the Lamar Jacksons on the slate?
Yeah, so part of it is informed by my belief that we'll see this one game be the center of gravity for this slate, right? So as we talk about these rostership projections changing over the course of the weekend, I think we're going to get to a point where Mahomes and Herbert are going to be two of, if not the two most rostered players at the position. So anytime that's the case, there's natural pivots to guys that have similar upside in a similar price range, right? So, almost as a leverage play off of my assumed rostership for the quarterbacks in that high scoring game, Josh Allen is going to be on the board. Obviously, this is no longer the stout New England defense of old. Lamar Jackson is also going to be on the board for me, right? Detroit is certainly improved on the defensive front, but can still be exposed, especially to an athlete as dynamic as Lamar Jackson, right? So, I'm usually not in this position. It felt kind of weird carving out my quarterback player pool, but basically all of the most expensive guys, actually all five of the most expensive guys, if you cancel out Justin Fields, are going to be in my player pool this week, right? I'm usually looking to get a little bit more into the mid tier, but where we sit tonight, I'm planning on paying up.
Yeah, I don't think that's wrong at all. Especially we're going to get into this mid tier and the lower tier quarterback, which is where we're seeing the rostership settle here. So I think that's a good immediate way to get leverage on the field in these GPPs. So I like that too. And they're always capable. They're all capable of being the QB1 on any given slate. Mm-hmm. So I like that. Let's move into this mid tier as well. Just a reminder, we got several people watching us now. Get those questions in if you have anything that you want to talk about, or DFS or otherwise. We'd love to help you. But in the mid tier here, in this kind of 65, maybe the 6,500 to 5,500 range, this is kind of where I'm starting to settle in as far as the cash pool goes. Geno Smith catches my eye right off the bat here. It's tough to call him a cash play after, as much as Seattle's passing game has struggled. But that's really on their offensive line injuries has been, putting Geno under a lot of pressure to begin with. But they play Arizona this week, who is last in pressure rate and also last in quarterback hit rate. So if we're to believe that Geno Smith is upright this entire game with a clean pocket, plus Arizona has allowed the fourth most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, and the second most receiving yards to wide receivers, and the fourth most catches, I think we could see Geno's best game to date. 6,000 is pretty fair for him. That's kind of where he's been hovering around. So I think at the high end of this 6,000 range, I like Geno. I like Geno a lot for a floor and a ceiling play this week. And then I guess for me on the lower end as well is Sam Howell. And I hate I hate saying it because this is directly against my team, but I do have to be a realist against my team as well. This is a weird one. This is the guy who has taken the most sacks in the NFL versus the team that has sacked the quarterback the least in the NFL. So something's got to give here. And the Giants defense did hurry Josh Allen 17 times last week. So we could be seeing a situation where Howell is under heavy fire and has a bad game. But honestly, I would side with the quarterback more than the defense in this case. So I think he's in play at cash, even though he's not projecting quite as highly rostered as Geno Smith. Where are you in this mid tier? This is an interesting realm of quarterbacks here because all have some upside, but who are you looking at here?
Yeah, so the two names that you mentioned are definitely the ones where I have the most interest in this mid tier. The challenge with both of them, they're each fine plays on merit, but if you're rostering the quarterback, you're looking for a stacking partner, which I think you can do successfully with either of these guys. You're also looking for a run back, and given their opponents, that's where it gets a little wobbly. There are some kind of points per dollar plays that you can explore, but I'm looking for that more explosive type of pairing or rundown with my run back. So I like these guys in a vacuum. I don't know if I'm going to be building a whole lot of stacks around them, just because the ceiling's kind of capped on the way back, and I'm not looking to do that in my tournaments, right? So I mean, Geno Smith is in a fantastic environment. If I were to venture out to build around one of these mid-tier guys in my core builds, it would probably be Geno. You mentioned the very favorable stats that the Cardinals are offering up. That is on the season, while they're largely at full strength, right? This week they're going to be without Antonio Hamilton. They're going to be without Jalen Thompson in their secondary. Several other guys, Budda Baker included, are looking very questionable, right? So we're looking at a shell of a already very favorable matchup in the Cardinals. So I think Geno probably has the best chance to do it. But for either of these guys, they're not a huge priority for me in terms of tournaments. One guy who is, just because he's going to be entirely overlooked, and he's got enough of a ground game to potentially make the difference for you without a heavy stack or a super strong run back, is Deshaun Watson. He's sitting at $5,700. He's very reasonably priced, and this matchup against the Colts is juicy, right? The ninth most points allowed to opposing quarterbacks on the season. They give up a fair amount of yardage on the ground to quarterbacks as well. I think this is the point where we can see Deshaun Watson kind of bring it all together, right? He's only played 3 games in the season. He's had 2 big outings. One of them was a very ground heavy game. One of them was a very pass heavy game. I think we see him really kind of start to bring those two together as soon as this week, right? So he'll be in the pool again. These middle tier guys, though, they're not a huge priority with how these games are lining up.
Yeah, and that's a good point you make about the stack partners too, because that really does matter. When you're playing the GPP game, it's not just about which team you're stacking; it's how you're stacking the entire game to begin with. So, I mean, you mentioned stacking Seattle, stacking Washington seems on paper like they could put up more points maybe than usual, but you're right. Like, who are you bringing it back with? Seattle, I mean, is it Marquise Brown? He's more of a cash play to me than a GPP bring back. Washington, you're stacking him. Wan'Dale Robinson is the bring back. He's also more of a cash play for me. Right now, neither one of those guys is flashing any kind of ceiling. Very safe PPR floor, but that to me screams cash a little bit more than full stack in this game. So I think you're right on with that kind of assessment here. The low end, I am not interested in really anything below Sam Howell. So I'll kind of maybe quickly turn it over to you. Russell Wilson is fine, I think, at 5,400. I don't know. I think if you're playing in cash, though, you find that extra couple of $100 you find that extra 100 to get to Howell. Even we didn't mention Jordan Love. I think he's got to at least have a mention here. The Green Bay offense has been very inconsistent, but I mean, any team that's playing Denver this year has to be considered, right? Like they're last in almost every team metric in the defensive category. So if both Aaron Jones and Christian Watson are healthy, maybe we see a full arsenal of weapons for Love. So I don't even mind that. But anything really below Russell Wilson, I don't think I'm touching this week. What about you?
Yeah, I'm right there with you, right? And a lot of it has to do with the sort of texture of the board, right? The guys that I would potentially consider in this low tier are in very low scoring games where I'm not going out of my way to get a second player in whatever the Atlanta Tampa Bay game, and I'm certainly not keen on a run back. Your call out of Love is fair. I think the argument or the reason why he's not in my player pool is twofold. Because he has that juicy Denver matchup, he's currently sitting as the third highest projected quarterback on my rostership projection. So, a chalky Jordan Love is something that I generally will try to avoid. And that has a lot to do with the fact that he's not very good at passing the ball. He's got like a 55% completion rate with some plus, above average to very good weapons at his disposal, right? So a lot of his productivity, through the 5 games this year, has been very touchdown dependent. Can that happen against Denver? Absolutely, right? But the point where you're really relying on that very variable outcome is a point where you're also setting yourself up to have a bad day.
Yeah, and I'm looking at his game logs too. It's if you look at those first 3 weeks where he put up some good scores, it can be a little misleading for DFS. I mean, like you said, TD dependent. I mean, he threw the ball 27 passes in week 1, 25 in week 2, but he threw for 6 touchdown passes in those games combined.
6 touchdowns, that's right.
That's an efficiency level that you can't really bank on as far as a floor goes. The only real true spike game I'm seeing is week 3 against New Orleans, where he threw the ball 44 times for a touchdown pass. He ran for 1 as well. But again, that was on a 50% completion percentage, which was his lowest mark of the season. And then since then, he's thrown 2 touchdowns against 6 picks. So, yeah, I mean, there's definitely not... I see a lot of people calling for him in cash, and you're saying the rostership projection agrees with that too. I'm just not comfortable with that, even in a matchup that really should be successful for him. All right, so that's the quarterback position. Before we get to the running backs, we've got a question in the chat from RJ Dakilla. All right, what a way to start. And you ready for this question, Eric? We've gotten to this. PPR, do I start Najee Harris or Zach Evans? We're at week 7. And these are the real questions that we have, and these are legitimate questions at this point, which is really kind of shows you the state of some of the things we've gone through with the NFL. So, what do you think, Najee Harris or Evans?
For me, it would be Najee Harris, right? Obviously, it's one of those kind of hold your nose and click the button sort of situations. But with Zach Evans in particular, he prior to this point, he's had opportunity to prove himself and earn a role in this offense, right? We saw Cam Akers, seeding work as quickly as week 1 in this season, and now that everyone that was ever on the Rams roster in front of him on the depth chart is injured, seemingly the opportunity is there. But I mean, you have to watch what these teams do, right? Like when it's Zach Evans' turn, they go out and they sign Darrell Henderson off the couch. They go out and sign Myles Gaskin off the couch, right? Like, how much, if at all, we see either of these guys this week is a fair question. But if nothing else, it screams that there's not very much confidence in this kid's ability with the ball in his hands, right? So I'm avoiding him at least until I can get a better picture of how they actually utilize him when we kick off this week.
Yeah, I agree for sure. And Najee Harris has been bad this year. I mean, there's no way around that. Correct. He still has yet to score. But you're right. I mean, in a decision like that, you go with the one who is more bankable touches at this point right now. I mean, even as poor as he's played, he's still um, out touched Jalen Warren, who is outplaying him. It was 15-12 last week against Baltimore, or 2 weeks ago against Baltimore. So yeah, you said it. Hold your nose. Hope he hope he finds the end zone there, or something like that, or or catches some passes. He said it's PPR. He was involved in the PPR game last year, but just isn't this year. But yeah, I agree. You can't trust Evans in your lineup unless you are super, super desperate. All right. And we got another question. I just traded full PPR Hawkinson, DK, and Pickens for Diggs, Logan Thomas, and Rashee Rice. Did I win that? I'm going to say no with my apologies. Logan Thomas to me that's a massive, massive tight end downgrade, especially with Justin Jefferson out. So then it's DK and Pickens for Diggs and Rashee Rice. I mean, I would still rather have a little more consistency from the two. I think you can maybe call that a wash, maybe. If Rice grows his role a little more in that case, the offense, which it seems like he might be doing, I think maybe the receiver side you'll be happy you got. But that to me is just such a big tight end downgrade. What do you think?
Yeah, that's the exact read that I have on it, right? Like in a vacuum, I probably like the DK Pickens side a bit more, but call it comparable, right? And if that's the case, you've got a comparable side and one side that is a considerable downgrade moving from Hawkinson to Logan Thomas, right? So I think the spirit of the deal is fine, right? Like this is probably an opportunity to get onto the Rashee Rice train at a relatively reasonable cost. But I don't know if I would click this button myself in my own league.
Yeah, and he's just following up. His receivers are now Kupp, Waddle, and Diggs, and yeah, I mean that's beautiful.
That's fantastic.
Again, though, I mean, I'm hoping that, I'm hoping that is enough there to carry you past the potential, zeros that you might take at that tight end position. But yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think in the spirit of this deal, I don't think you got fleeced by any stretch of the imagination. And if Rice, if Rice does increase in his snap share, I think you might wind up winning this one as well. But thank you for that question. We're going to get right back to the DFS talk. Again, keep the questions coming in the chat. We'll get to them at the end of each segment here as much as we can. So we're going to go to running backs now. I'll kind of kick it off here again in the cash sentiment. I mentioned at the beginning of the show that I am looking to spend a bit on the running back position. I don't feel the need to get up to Eckler or Barkley at all, which is nice because, we've got some kind of mid-high end running backs that are in smash spots to me as far as floor and ceiling goes. And that's always a week that I like playing the running backs here. So Josh Jacobs at 7,400 to me feels egregiously cheap for the fact that he's getting the same usage that he's got last year now that we saw him become the RB1 overall. He's playing a 79% snap share. He has 76% of the team's rushing attempts for the entire season. Also has a 17% target share. So at 7,400 for me, that seems like such an easy click into cash because barring injury, I don't see how he busts in this game against the Bears. And then the other one that I'm really, really into, and this will be a tough decision too if we go back to that other talk at the quarterback, how much I liked Geno Smith at quarterback. I don't know if I can play Geno Smith because I'm pretty much bound to Kenneth Walker this week in cash too at 7,000, and Walker isn't involved in the passing game, so I don't think they correlate well together in cash. But this is another one where he is dominating the carry share in Seattle. Zach Charbonnet is really not a factor this season, and he has 6 rushing touchdowns already. Throw in the matchup against the Cardinals, and I think these are 2 guys that I'm just like clicking into my cash and loving that they're in this, because this is the kind of players I like to play in cash. Where are you on the running back position? I think this is an interesting one for GPP because I think the field is going to follow me here in cash, which leaves you with some leverage options. So where are you sitting on those? And any other thoughts you have on those 2 guys that I said?
Yeah, so everyone in here, specifically Jacobs and Walker, these are guys that should be rostered on merit. The field following you is really the thing to keep an eye on, right? As we sit right now, which is often the case on Fridays, the rostership is a little bit more spread out, but we do have a couple of guys pushing that 20% range. Kenneth Walker and Josh Jacobs are among them, right? So if we see that push much further, 24, 26%, maybe even higher, that would be a point where I would try to go a little bit underweight. But in terms of their environment, I mean, they are set up to have very good days in the office in their own right, both of them. As we're talking through this, I actually refreshed my projected rostership. And I saw that Saquon Barkley is looking at about 3.5% right now. 8.1K is probably a bit more than I would want to pay for him. But if we're talking about a world where you want to figure out your run back to your Howell stacks, a 3% rostered Saquon Barkley who looked to be shades of his former self last week is a fine way to do it, right? So he's not going to be like a priority for me in terms of standalone options here, but in that context, perfectly viable. If he stays this low, I might sprinkle him in a bit more than I otherwise would. And then staying up here in the top, Bijan Robinson, that there will be a point where he just absolutely explodes onto a given slate and breaks it wide open. Being that he hasn't really had that ceiling performance yet, 7.3K is a little bit pricey for him, but also against this Tampa Bay run defense, right? Like they're pretty susceptible. Well, A, they're not the run defense that they have been in recent years, and B, they're relatively susceptible to the counterpunch of a receiver or a running back catching balls out of the backfield as well. Obviously, Bijan Robinson is more than capable of doing that. So, not a major priority, but slate breaking upside is going to be there with him every week, and it doesn't look like he's going to be too popular.
Yeah, I mean, why not, right? I mean, that's he's at the very least he's playing the passing downs very well. So I kind of like that call as well, and then we're seeing the rostership plummet as a result. So moving into this mid tier, and there's one guy that we're going to have to talk about, which has been, he's been the elephant in the room for us the entire season, and I'm having a hard time this week. So, but I'm going to start quick in this mid tier with the highest projected roster running back on the slate is Isaiah Pacheco at 6,100. He is, excuse me, absolutely a cash lock for me on this slate at that price. I mean, he's dominating the Chiefs backfield right now, and he has a 70% carry share on the season, which is in line with the first 2 guys I mentioned. All of a sudden last week, he got a 16% target share from Patrick Mahomes as well. So if he's the passing back now too, I don't, again, see any downside in this game against the Chargers defense that we've seen gashed by opposing running backs for years now. I believe they have allowed, where did I put it here? They've allowed the 10th most fantasy points per game to running backs, which is actually an improvement over the last couple of years for them, but still bottom 10. And, I will say, for as right as my preseason takes on Jahmyr Gibbs were with the stuff that I put out there, I've been equally wrong on Jerick McKinnon's, who is almost not even on the roster anymore. I had that McKinnon was going to outscore Gibbs in PPR this year. I'm going to lose a bet because of that, regardless of being right on Gibbs. But I don't know. I mean, McKinnon looks like he's on the way out, and Edwards-Helaire is not a factor either. So, real quick before Gibbs is the one I do want to talk to you about, but real quick before we get to Gibbs, how are you treating Pacheco as a GPP player, knowing that he is absolutely going to be a top 3 rostered running back, maybe even the top 1, which he is right now?
Yeah, on my side, I see Pacheco as number 5, but actually the top 6 are within less than 1 percentage point, right? So he's up there in that upper echelon of rostership. When I posited earlier why Patrick Mahomes wasn't projected for higher rostership, here is your answer, right? It's all going to Isaiah Pacheco, and for good reason, right? He had that huge game last week in terms of his target share and his role in the receiving game. But even prior to that, right, he opened the season with 4 receptions, and my hair was on fire. It's like, this was not part of his projection whatsoever, right? So like, now that he's getting any of this work, right, these games where he gets 2 or 3 catches, it's all gravy, right? So for Pacheco in particular, if he remains as popular, I probably won't play him on an island. But I mean, he's got a game with four targets. He's got a game with 6 targets. I mean, maybe like in, I don't know, 10% of builds, stacking him with Patrick Mahomes might be an interesting combination. A way to kind of hedge his rostership by going with a unique texture on your build overall. But kind of like we were talking about with some of these top tier guys that are drawing rostership as well on merit, fantastic spot, right? Like you mentioned, the Chargers are improving in terms of their play against the run. The metric I always like to look at is yards allowed before contact. They're still the worst in the league, almost 2 yards before contact, 1.98. They've been in that position for as long as there's been internet, right? So,
how do you not fix that every year?
There's not, with your defensive-minded head coach, Brandon Staley. So either way, we'll
looking at you, Brandon Staley,
stuff for another day.
Yeah,
but Pacheco's in a fantastic spot on merit alone.
Yeah. All right. So Gibbs, David Montgomery is out, maybe for multiple games.
Correct.
This is. I think you have to assume a fairly sizable role, right? So, I mean, I'm just going to look up real quick that when Montgomery missed in week 3 against the Falcons, Gibbs had 17 carries for 80 yards, and 1 catch for 2 yards out of backfield. So they kind of used him as the between the tackles player there. They're still very hesitant to use him in the red zone, which we saw coming in. He definitely is still a liability in pass protect. The suggestion seems that he's going to get a pretty full role here. So what are you doing with him right now? I'll be honest, I don't know what I'm doing with him yet.
Yeah, look, I highlighted him for the distinct purpose and the sole purpose of calling out the fact that not only is David Montgomery out, but Craig Reynolds is looking pretty iffy. He did get back to a limited practice today, but he's dealing with a hamstring and toe. And the thing to remember here is, while for some reason Dan Campbell hates talented running backs, he also hates changing his game plan, right? Like, regardless of who's carrying the ball back there, they're trotting out the same game plan. So if we're talking about a situation where Reynolds is also out, or at least hampered, this could very much so be that ceiling week for Jahmyr Gibbs. His matchup isn't fantastic, right? I would categorize Baltimore as above average against the run. But really the story for me with him is twofold. What's going on with Greg Reynolds? If he's out, like, you almost have to click the button. And then secondarily, where his rostership falls, because he's in that sort of amalgam of near 20% guys. And I do expect to see both waning and waxing with this lot of players as we get closer to Sunday.
Yeah, and I agree too. I'm, I think you got to really kind of watch that rostership and see, what the best place to play him is. As someone who has been an outspoken downer on Gibbs, I do think he needs to be in all player pools this week. Even if Craig Reynolds does wind up playing, Reynolds played last time, and Gibbs played over him, and he even got the carries inside the 20 over him too. So, this is just something. I think you're right that Dan Campbell's, game planning, like this is how they're winning football games right now. I would caution that they lean into the pass a little bit more. They got the full healthy complement of wide receivers. They can do that. But again, pass protection goes into that as well. And Baltimore has a good pass rush. So, maybe they try to not do that if they don't trust Gibbs to help protect in that fierce pass rush that Baltimore offers, and they don't go pass heavy. So I think it's a fascinating situation to monitor this week. I'm with you. I think you have to be a little bit more bullish than bearish on Gibbs, just given the opportunity. And like you said, if Reynolds is out, who else are they going to give him the ball to? Divine Ozigbo, am I even saying his name right? Is he even healthy? I don't think he's practiced in some points this week. So Gibbs could be a fun player to watch this week. All right. Anyone else in this mid-tier range before we wrap up the running backs quick?
A few names. I think Aaron Jones is interesting, right? To the extent that Jordan Love is drawing rostership, a very clear pivot and an equally favorable spot is Aaron Jones. I think at some point, as soon as this week, Green Bay will wake up to the fact that they need to center their offense around Aaron Jones first and foremost. So he's an interesting leverage play there. Ramondre Stevenson, last week I think he was like 5K roughly, and made us all look silly for fading him. I had some exposure to him on the wrong rosters or the wrong builds, but he did the Ramondre Stevenson thing, right? He found his way into the end zone. He caught 5 balls, right? Like this is precisely what we were hoping for him to be. And while he's got a tough matchup against the Bills, game script obviously favors him. He's clearly the receiving option out of that backfield, in a presumed trailing situation. And Buffalo, number 4 in the league in terms of yards per reception to running backs out of the backfield. That was very much so the stat that I exploited in that London game that I shipped with a Travis Etienne captain, right? Like they'll give up some yards to backs. So, if he's going to be overlooked, he's someone you can get leverage on the field with. If nothing else, at 5.6K, he is a pretty solid points per dollar value as well.
Yeah. I don't mind that at all. And I didn't have any of them last week. And I kind of, saw the undoing as that went there. So I like that call too. I will say also, keep an eye on the Cleveland running back situation. Kareem Hunt has popped up as questionable for this game against Indianapolis. I think if he's out, I'm really into Jerome Ford as a tournament play here. Hunt with Hunt there, he had 40% of the carries for Cleveland. It was, Ford against San Francisco. Ford had the late game carries that kind of highlighted him, but it was a pretty even split. But it bears mentioning the Colts defense gives up a lot of fantasy points. It's 7th most fantasy points per game to running backs. And they just lost their giant nose tackle to a PED suspension. So, I think that we could see something out of there. At Ford is 5,100, which I think is a nice value if Kareem Hunt does miss this game, which could be interesting. I just don't know how I'd play him. What do you think there?
Yeah, look, I think you can kind of do some skinny stacks in with this game in particular, just kind of one-off guys. I love Jerome Ford this week. I am lighting a candle and throwing salt over my shoulder and whatever voodoo or superstition of your choice that Kareem Hunt, in fact, does play. Because Kareem Hunt got the touchdown last week, right? If you watch that touchdown, it looked like he was running through molasses, but he made his way into the end zone. And we know that DFS players love chasing last week's production. So I'm hoping that he's in there so that he can draw some rostership away from Ford, because against a very difficult San Francisco defense last week, and really throughout the year when he's had opportunities, Ford's looked dynamic. So anything that is going to draw attention away from him is something I'm in favor of. Even if Hunt is in fact ruled out, he's sitting around 2 or 3%. So it's not like all of a sudden Ford's going to jump up to 20, right? But I really like the leverage that Ford offers if people are going to go their way over to Hunt.
All right, awesome. So I'm glad you're on the Ford train with me here too. So let's move over to wide receiver. At the top, we've got a lot to like at the top end of this pool here. Cooper Kupp it didn't take him long to be priced well above the field at 9,500. But I mean, I'm going to say right off the bat he's well worth it in cash, I think, and in GPP. He's absolutely been dominating since he came off IR. He's at a 42% target share in his 2 weeks, which is absolutely insane. And that's also, by the way, with Puka Nacua, who we were wondering what was going to happen as far as his usage. He still has 18 targets through these 2 weeks that Cooper Kupp has been back. So it's not like even a heavy target share from him is affecting Kupp. I think of any of the high price skill position players, he's the best one here. Pittsburgh has given up the 4th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. He could absolutely steamroll them this week. And I think he is well worth the 9,500 in cash, which is a tough price to get up to. We also have Stephon Diggs up here. We have Keenan Allen in that Chiefs-Chargers game we talked about. We have Devontae Adams, who's crying about his usage. So, you get that squeaky wheel thing maybe with him, even though Brian Hoyer's throwing him the ball. And Amon-Ra St. Brown. Is there anybody here you want to kind of talk about as a standout play to you?
Man, all these guys up top are significant priorities for me, right? So it really boils down to how do you make the pieces all fit in a logical and correlated way. I kind of like this Rams Pittsburgh game to maybe shoot out a little bit. I don't know if they'll push north of 50, but I like the over on 44, and for me that really opens up 2 considerations. Kupp, like you mentioned, is just an absolute smash. He's 9.5K. He's crazy expensive. Pittsburgh, not only are they favorable matchup to wide receivers, but specific to slot wide receivers. They have allowed almost 3 times as many points, fantasy points, to receivers lining up in the slot than those that are lining up out wide. So sets up very, very nicely for Cooper Kupp. But alternatively, if you're talking about a tournament context, Puka Nacua is still plenty involved. He still gets looks out of the slot. He had essentially a gimme touchdown just kind of squirt out of his hands last week. So he offers kind of an interesting leverage play in terms of large field tournaments. And then, for me, I like how this week sets up for Stephon Diggs. I really do. This New England secondary has become a turnstile since Christian Gonzalez went down. To the thing of note is really just watching the rostership, right? Like Josh Allen looks like he's going to be relatively popular. That's typically an indicator of how Stephon Diggs will land as well. He's also up there in terms of rostership. So if we see the trade winds start to blow, and maybe more and more of this rostership falls into that Kansas City game, I don't mind firing up a ton of Diggs as long as he's not too popular.
Yeah, let's talk about Keenan Allen real quick too. I'm a little back and forth on him, kind of as I was last week. Generally, when Eckler is there at these prices, I shy away from Keenan Allen because we've seen data where Eckler's receiving production does negatively affect Keenan Allen's ceiling. We didn't really see it last week. He still had 11 targets and he went 7 catches for 85 yards and a score, which is, that's great. So, it's not a great matchup as far as matchup goes, but it is the high game, the high scoring game of KC and the Chargers. Um, I don't know. I mean, I'm seeing fairly high rostership on him, and I'm not sure how comfortable I am with that in cash. I'd rather just get up to Cooper Kupp at that point when you're spending $8,600 on a wide receiver. I feel way better about Kupp's floor and ceiling than I do about Keenan Allen. I think they're priced closely enough to each other that I'd just rather get up to Kupp. How are you using Keenan Allen this week?
Yeah, so my exposure to Keenan Allen will be in the context of my Kansas City Chargers stacks, right? And as we sit right now, Keenan Allen is drawing a fair amount of rostership. He's floating in that like 8 to 10% range, but he's about half that of Josh Palmer, around 18%, right? So, in terms of the ways to get into the Chargers side, if Keenan Allen is going to be the overlooked receiving option, he's going to become a priority for me. I don't love the matchup, right? Like this Chiefs secondary is really playing at a different level than they were, even in some of their recent Super Bowl years. To be fair, Trent McDuffie, their slot corner, is probably the most favorable matchup, but he's having a fine season by slot standards, right? He's allowing about 69% catch rate. His yards per reception is right around 11. Like everything that you would ask for from good slot corner play, you're getting from McDuffie. So, Allen avoids the more difficult matchups in Snead and Williams, but it's not like he's got a cakewalk in either. So, this is a circumstance where I probably wouldn't look to play him in cash in your example, or play him in. But if he's going to be, the highest upside, lowest rostered option on this Chargers side, I mean, he's got to be a priority on a board that's pretty bleak in terms of game environments.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So we're kind of on the same page as him. He's a complicated one for me right now too. So that's another one to watch. Um, Getting into this mid tier, this is usually um, a difficult area for me as a cash player because wide receiver on DraftKings always seems to set up as such a studs and duds thing. Is you can always find at least one 4K and under player that profiles well for volume that you just throw into your cash. And this week is no different. You already mentioned Josh Palmer at 4,800, which we can get into in a second. Um, he seems like an easy cash play. There's a couple of others. So usually when I do that, I don't really find myself in this 5,500 to 7K range. So I'll kind of let you take the lead on this. A couple of guys that I am into, if you do have the extra money, um, or if you're not paying, if you're playing maybe cheaper at running back than I would be. Tyler Lockett in a game we mentioned already with that Seattle Arizona game. He leads the Seahawks in targets, yet is still $800 cheaper than DK Metcalf. So I think at $6,000, he's definitely fine to play in this cash format if you have that money. And then Zay Flowers as well is the other one in this range that kind of stands out to me. He's leading the Ravens in targets by a good amount now. And leads them in air yards too. So even though Detroit is a better matchup for tight ends, which maybe benefits Mark Andrews more than Zay Flowers, I still think Flowers is a bit too cheap at 5,700. So those are kind of the two guys in this range that I'm looking at for cash. What about you? If we're looking at 5,000 to, or maybe like 5,500, 5,400 to 7,000, what are you looking at here?
Yeah, there's a couple of guys that are interesting. I think you make sound cases for both Lockett and Zay Flowers. If you are going to fire up a Geno build, you have a clear stacking partner, right? This secondary for the Cardinals has been a punching bag for us all season. They are now injured, so we're getting an even softer version of that. That bodes well for Lockett. It also bodes well for DK Metcalf. Like you mentioned, he is more expensive. I think that is going to draw a bit of rostership away from him, but also he's going to see the most of Marco Wilson, who to date is one of our favorite guys to target, right? 80% catch rate, 2 yards allowed per route covered, right? Just basically anytime someone is running in his coverage, they're hauling it in. And I mean, to say there's a size difference between him at 5'11", 196 and the behemoth that is DK Metcalf, this sets up as a beautiful spot for some yards after the catch. So like DK Metcalf, especially in the context of where I'm building around Geno. I also think Amari Cooper is kind of an interesting option here, right? 6.1K, like he's shown us the upside to justify a pretty considerably higher price tag than that, right? Like the Cardinals secondary, we've been beating up on the Colts secondary all year, specifically their perimeter corners. That's very much so where Cooper is going to spend the majority of his time. Only about a quarter of his snaps are in the slot, so he'll be seeing guys that are allowing 75 and 78% catch rates respectively. Part of this is I'm really buying into this being a boom week for Deshaun Watson. So obviously that bodes well for Amari Cooper, and I certainly don't mind the price tag. And then right here at the cutoff of the mid tier, 5.6K, Christian Watson. If I were in charge of the Denver secondary, I would probably assign Patrick Surtain to cover Christian Watson. But Patrick Surtain's, he's not shadowing at the rate that we've seen from him in the past, right? He'll have a game here or there where he'll shadow for 55, sometimes close to 60% of snaps. But really, the wide receivers that are lining up against this Broncos secondary are seeing a pretty even amount of both Surtain, which is clearly a difficult matchup, but also Damari Mathis, who is hemorrhaging yards and touchdowns and yak. So with how Christian Watson profiles, even if it's only 12 or 14 snaps in Mathis's coverage, any one of those can be a game-breaking play. So he'll be in the pool for me as well.
Yeah, and an interesting thing on Surtain too is when they played the Jets, he was on Lazard, not what's that? Oh, how did I mute? I'm not muted. Can you hear me? What happened?
Oh,
uh-oh.
Perhaps it's on my end.
Oh, all right. Am I talking? All right. Well, I'm going to keep talking. Somebody can tell me if you can't hear me in chat. Who were we talking about? Patrick Surtain. He actually was in the Jets game. Was fascinating. He was covering Alan Lazard, not Garrett Wilson, in that one. So I think the points you make on shadowing are very fair there to wonder how that's gonna impact his defense in the Green Bay passing game, because for sure he's the one that you have to worry about. Nobody else in that defense is. So if you got to guess correctly as to where he goes with that defense, so I think that's a good call as well. So if we're looking in this lower range now too, and we see some questions in the chat, we'll get to that in just one second. If we're looking in this lower range as well, there's a couple of guys that I'm into for salary saving purposes here. I mentioned Marquise Brown before with respect to the Seattle-Arizona game, 5,300. He isn't really a GPP play for me, but he's been just so consistent. He has double-digit targets in 4 out of 6 games this season. And the matchup and the game script should work in his favor, where he's a solid cash play at 5,300. Josh Palmer, obviously, with a 97% snap share, has to be considered in your cash pool as well. Moving down even a little bit more, some guys I'm looking at in that Washington Giants game for some cheap volume, one of which is Wan'Dale Robinson, who has a really meager average depth of target and air yard share right now, but he's getting the targets. He's not yet $4,000, and it's a 22% target share in that offense, and that's with 2 different quarterbacks. So it doesn't really matter who's throwing him the ball. He's kind of a safe floor play there. And then on the other side of that thing, Curtis Samuel all of a sudden has burst back onto the scene as relevant. I mean, he's playing almost a 70% snap share right now. He's averaging 6 touches now per game, whereas Jahan Dotson is starting to look like he's the distant third in this passing game. So I like Curtis Samuel at 4,000 in that game too. I think you can play those guys in cash. Are you back? Are we together here? Can you hear me?
I believe we're back.
Okay, we're back. Good. So how about you? Any names on this low end that you want to throw at us? And again, we talked about Rashee Rice, so I'm curious about your take on him because he's another fascinating player in fantasy. What do you got in this lower end here?
Yeah, there's a lot to like in this lower range, right? Holding true to the stars and scrub nature that you laid out. I talked about Christian Watson before my technical difficulties. All of the same points can be made for Romeo Doubs, right? He's not quite as explosive as a player, clearly. So his ability to break one wide open in his share of snaps and Mathis's coverage isn't as high as Watson, but still he'll have those snaps. He can do a lot with them. Terry McLaurin at 5.4K, he's been on an absolute tear facing some of the more difficult matchups in the NFL secondary thus far. Now he gets a much more favorable turn against your beloved New York Giants. So don't mind him. I kind of like going back to the well with Deontay Johnson here. I haven't solidified it, but I'm sort of tooling around with some Ram stacks. Deontay Johnson in his first week back, is largely projected to go overlooked. The way that you attack this Rams secondary is over the middle, right? Like you want that matchup with Kobe Durant, and he would slot in and see the vast majority of his routes in his coverage. So he'll be in the pool. I mean, I don't really like saying the name, but Jahan Dotson is in a good spot. If you're really feeling froggy, you can click the button. Rashee Rice Rashee Rice, I should say, is interesting, right? Like 4.7K. The thing that surprised me most about him, and I don't know what you're seeing on your side, I've got him in that kind of mid single digit range. I see him in that like 5 to 7% range in terms of his projected rostership. I mean, if that holds true, he's going to be a player that I have a ton of interest in, right? Like he'll see Michael Davis. He'll see Jasir Taylor in the slot. His catch rate doesn't look great overall, right? In terms of the matchup, it's right around 58%, but he's given up a good amount of yards per catch by slot corner standards. He's up over that 13% range. So, Rice is playing in the slot at about 62% of his snaps. Favorable matchup in the game we want to get into. Seems like he's being overlooked, right? Like that's checking a lot of boxes for me. And then the last name that I have here that you didn't talk about, Michael Wilson. If you need to get into some Seahawks stacks, he sees the field enough and is cheap enough to where he's at least worthy of consideration as a potential run back.
All right, awesome. So the Rice rostership is odd to me, I guess. Maybe it's just because he seems like on Twitter this past week he's been like the favorite of everybody, that everybody's kind of calling for a Rice breakout. But then you look, and I see the same thing as you, that we're right at about 5%. And some places even having a little bit less than that. And I guess it's just because it's such a weird role he's playing right now. He still is not seeing over 50% of snaps, but he's seeing almost 38% targets per route run. So it's basically like when he's on the field, they're giving him the ball. It's like they're game planning him onto the field and getting him the ball. So, I mean, I'm kind of with you there. Okay. You got to play him in GPP at that rostership, right?
Yeah. I mean, if this holds steady, he's a major priority. And while your slot data points are spot on, looking at the actual routes run, there's a pretty big breakthrough here, right? Like through the first 4 or so games of the season, it was MVS and Sky Moore leading the wide receiver group in routes run. They were in like the high 20s, low 30s every week. And then just a smattering, a maddening collection of 4 or 5 guys that got like 8 to 12. And last week, Rashee Rice was tied for second with Sky Moore with 22 routes run, right? So to your point, when he's out there, he's running routes. He's clearly a priority, and he's the first of that sort of pool of randomness within their wide receiver 3 ranks to really take that jump forward into more routes. So I'm comfortable, using that as a sign of things to come. And again, if all of this holds true, I am going to have way too much Rashee Rice by by relative standards to what he's going to be rostered at.
I think it's the breakout this week. That's not that's not based on anything I'm reading that they're going to give him more work, but I just think it's all lining up that way. So we forgot to mention too that Justin Watson is now out. He broke his arm or something like that, but he's not a part of that receiver core anymore either. So I'm calling the Rice breakout this week. Why not? Why not? Right? No, I'll back it up in my GPPs. And it sounds like you're going to too. All right. So that's the wide receivers. We got maybe 10 minutes, maybe a little bit less to get to the tight end positions here. But we do have one question in the chat from Jim. Welcome, Jim. And he says, how many carries will Freeman get for the Rams this week? So, Jim, we were talking a bit about that Rams backfield earlier and how to handle it and how we're not totally on board with trusting any of it. But what do you think there, Eric? I'm of the mindset that he doesn't really get any carries. That if he's anything, he works maybe in the passing downs, which is something we've seen him do a little bit more than others. But I wouldn't play him this week at all. What do you think?
Yeah, I've got a similar look here, right? Like the reason why he was elevated from the practice squad is because of Evans' difficulty with pass pro. Because they play for the Rams, that means that I wouldn't be surprised at all if we see Freeman actually have more snaps this week. Los Angeles has a 60-40 split in favor of pass to run. So, there's going to be more circumstances where they look to Freeman and his reliability in terms of pass pro. But when he's out there, I wouldn't expect him to carry the ball very much. He might get some targets, right? So if we're splitting up rushes, I'd say he maybe gets 25 to 30% at the high end. If we're splitting up touches, it might be closer to a 50-50 split, or more realistically, maybe like a third with a couple of different guys. But all of this is to say, rostering a Rams running back this week is not going to be a fun time.
No, I agree. And there's really nothing at all to suggest it's any one of them that should be getting anything over the other guys. It could be any one of them, like you say. And it could be none of them. They could just totally lean into the pass. We could see Zach Evans 6 carries for 21 yards lead the team in rushing or something like that, as they just work where they're strong, especially in this matchup. All right, so tight ends, real quick. Thank you for that question, Jim. I hope you have a better option than Freeman on your team. So the tight ends, we'll get into some of the cheap ones here in a minute. Is there anything else that you want to say, first of all, about Travis Kelce? We kind of hit on him with our Chiefs talk before, that he's a smash play every week. But is there anything else you want to bring up before we move on?
Yeah, just to kind of reiterate, right? Like watch his projected rostership. If it slides, if pairing him up with Mahomes doesn't look like it's going to be very popular, it could be the key to the slate, right? But it's very expensive to do.
It is, especially with the bring back options as well. All right, so moving on to other tight end positions, I want to mention Mark Andrews real quick. I'm into him in GPPs this week, definitely not in cash, but in GPPs I'm into him. At 5,700, I'd say you can argue that he's a bit too cheap for this week, especially I kind of pointed out before with the Zay Flowers talk that tight ends are the weak spot so far this season for Detroit. They're giving up the fourth most fantasy points per game and the third most receptions. So I'm into Mark Andrews in that end, and after that, I dip way into the low end here. So any players in the tight end pool that you want to talk about, maybe in the 3,500 to 5K range?
Yeah, this week sets up kind of weird at tight end. It'll sound counterintuitive, and just know that it feels counterintuitive when I think through it as well. I'm probably going to rotate around Kyle Pitts and Jonnu Smith a good amount this week. Obviously Kyle Pitts is the much more dynamic of the two, but Jonnu Smith is a perfectly capable kind of move tight end sort of profile. They're both relatively cheap. They sealed a ton, right? Like this isn't a binary where if one is producing, the other is not. They're both out there for 65% of snaps or more on any given game. A good percentage of those together, I should say. So they're both in the pool. I'm not going to have a ton of exposure to this Atlanta Tampa Bay game, so that is something to consider. David Njoku, 3.4K. He seems to have those ceiling games when Deshaun Watson's on. Again, I like how this week sets up for Deshaun Watson. And then beyond that, really getting into the doldrums here, right? Dawson Knox is kind of interesting just because of his matchup specifically against that Patriots defense and largely being overlooked. Michael Mayer, he took a huge step forward last week in terms of his involvement in the offense. Sitting all the way down at 2.7K, I think it's fine, but I'm not going out of my way to get exposure to the Brian Hoyer led Raiders offense either, right? So it's kind of a mess, right? Like I like those guys we talked about up top. Pitts is athletic enough to do it on any given week, but no single one of these tight ends is really making me feel great.
Yeah, and I like the Mayer call there too, for sure. And he's a guy that I wasn't on at all in fantasy going into this year either. I mean, he projected to be such a good blocker that I just, I didn't see the offensive involvement in there. So, but it does look like he's showing that. I think at 2,700, there's really, really low risk to playing him there. I think in a cash setting, if you need that money, you can go down there. The cash tight end I'm probably looking at this week is Luke Musgrave for Green Bay at 3,300. We've mentioned before that there's a lot of targets to spread around in Green Bay with everybody healthy this year. So there's downside there. But I mean, at 3,300, he's had 2 games already this year where he's had 7 or more targets, one of which was last week. Denver's given up the most fantasy points per game to tight end. So at 3,300, I think this is kind of a nice, safe-ish cash play where you don't need him to do all that much, and anything he does on top is as you say, gravy. And I'll just throw Trey McBride's name in there as well. He out-snapped Ertz for the first time this season last week, 44-35, and they had the same amount of targets in that game. So, I mean, I think for a team evaluating their young talent, it's probably in their best interest to play McBride over Ertz, or even trade Ertz at this point if they can get something for him. So I will have exposure to Trey McBride as well in maybe that tournament setting where I want a super, super, super cheap guy. But Seattle is also a tough matchup for tight ends this year. All right. Anybody else anything that you want to kind of mention before we say our farewells?
If we have a minute to talk about defenses, the Browns have absolutely no business being 3.3K. Jim Schwartz has this unit playing at an all world level. Like there's a world where we're talking about the 2023 Browns defense as one of the all time defenses. They're right in the middle of the pack in terms of their price tag. They have the smash matchup against the Gardner Minshew-led Indianapolis Colts. So yeah, we have a few minutes. I'll squeeze in some defense talk.
All right, why not some defense talk? We got a couple of minutes. Yeah, I know I'm with you there too. I mean, they were priced up $1,100 after last week where I understand they were playing the 49ers, but that was an absolutely inexplicable price tag at $2,200 that they were at last week, even against the 49ers. So, I mean, I'm with you that I think they're too cheap. In the cash realm, looks like right now the Giants are the chalkiest team, which I'm certainly not comfortable with. They're last in sack rate on the season. I do understand they're playing Sam Howell, who has taken the most sacks for any quarterbacks this year, but 3,000 to me is a little steep for them. Even in a good matchup, I'm probably going down further. I like to spend in cash as little on defense as I possibly can. So this is going to be either the Chiefs at 2,400 or the Ravens at 2,500 in my cash lineups this week. What else are you looking at?
Yeah, both viable, right? I mentioned earlier this Chiefs defense is one of the better ones we've seen. So, to get them that cheap in a game that people are generally looking for the offense, there should be some leverage there. The Falcons are also one of the better top to bottom defenses, especially their perimeter secondary. They're getting a matchup against Baker Mayfield, who has been known to turn the ball over a little bit, which is really what we're going for with these defenses, right? Like, you want the sacks, you want the turnovers. Both of those have the potential to lead the scoring, which is really all that you need from one of these cheapies.
All right, yeah. So I'm with you there. What do you think, before we sign off here, as long as we're talking about defenses here, I've actually gotten this question already this week, that you're asking me if the Bills are worth paying up at 4,200 in GPP, because nobody will, and the fact that they're facing Mac Jones. I've been saying no, because, I just don't think Belichick will let Mac Jones lose the game for them with turnovers and whatnot. So I don't know. I don't know if the defensive upside is there per se, but what do you think on that?
Yeah, I think that's the right play. Some people are, right? Like, they're currently sitting 7th in terms of their projected rostership, around 5.5%. So, you're not getting, much, if any, leverage on the field. And also, like, the Bills have had a couple of outbursts, right? But they're not this this stone-clad defense that's just shutting everybody down and creating a ton of turnovers, right? So, very expensive. They're going to draw a little ownership. It feels like a pretty clear avoid for me.
They do lead the NFL in sack rate, or in sacks, which helps.
Sure. Yeah.
For sure. But yeah, I don't know. That game doesn't really strike me as one that creates the opportunities you want for 4,200. But I guess, people are playing them. So I guess they are viable. All right, that's going to do it for us. Thank you, everybody who joined us on this Week 7 slate. We hope we've kind of shed some clarity on the situation and given you some ideas for your lineups this week. Eric, where can our wonderful listeners find you and find your work?
All of my work rolls up into my Twitter/X. I'm holding on for dear hope that we can keep calling it Twitter, which is @FantasyNav. That's the best way to find where it all lands. And here in about, I guess it's 19 days now, getting ready to tip off the college basketball season. So we're talking a ton of that over on Green Screens Media. We just did our Big Ten preview. So you'll find that all up in my feeds, and you can find a link to our YouTube page there @FantasyNav on Twitter.
Awesome. And Elon Musk is going to find some way to shock us through the computer if we keep calling it Twitter on there.
Yeah, right.
He's working on the technology right now. Yeah, awesome. So, you can find my stuff over on Football Diehards right now. You can find my cash game article and my pricing exploitation article over on Fantasy Pros. And I'll kind of piggyback off you, Eric, that once the NBA season starts in full on next Wednesday, you'll be finding me all over the place with that as well. because that's a big DFS time for us. All right. Thank you again for everybody that joined us in chat. We'll see you next week for week 8, almost the halfway point, believe it or not. For Eric, I'm Jamie, and good luck with your lineups. We will see you next week.